Joining me now is Michael Goldfarb, former FAA Chief of Staff, and airline expert Seth Kaplan of Airline Weekly magazine. Gentlemen, welcome. And the one sign of relief that we have here is we found the plane, and we are beginning to recover bodies. What does this tell us about the rest of this process going forward, Michael? How does this play itself out now?
It's a terribly tragic end to the year for the families and for aviation to have this have happen. And the fact is that we're going to fairly rapidly, I believe, find the black boxes, the key elements of the missing piece of this. We know weather was a huge factor. We know the pilot's reaction maybe have exacerbated that problem. Weather alone never brings a plane down. We think it stalled. We think because it stalled, it came down intact. The debris field seems to back that up. So we're going to get to the bottom of this and solve this one. But I think we have other issues we need to talk about flying in that very, very busy, congested airspace.
I want to get to that because I think that is a very important aspect of this investigation that's going to reveal a lot about air safety in that region and the like. But Seth, how long do you think this is going to play itself out? I mean, what is the timeline typically once you've located the plane to begin the process of recovering not just the bodies but the key instruments that are going to help us solve what happened?
Yeah, and we'll see how Indonesia, taking the lead, handles this. But typically, something like this in the U.S., in a matter of weeks or months, we would have some sort of preliminary report about what has happened, some sort of indication of, look, this is where we think things are going. But then usually years before there's a final report. In this case, this is not MH370, where we just don't know what we're working with. I mean, here we are now, just days later, with a debris field, and certainly a lot of clues there. The black boxes, that cockpit voice and data recorder, for example, likely still pinging, and anyway, we know, roughly where in the world they are. And so it will be a more standard process, not to say that these things are ever easy or any less tragic for the families, even with that certainty that they now have, but nothing like MH370, more like, well, if you could call them this, more typical accidents.
So how, in your estimation, Michael, how has this been handled so far? Seth referenced the government sort of handling this and how they proceed. Clearly, there was a ball dropped here today or yesterday with the local television. Yeah. How is this going to play itself out, do you think, from that standpoint for the families?
Well, I think, the families, the good news is that AirAsia has taken lessons learned from Malaysia 370. So that clearly the CEO gets it. They're treating the families differently. Whether, I think, as Seth said, whether the Indonesians step up aggressively and bring in the authorities from around the world and move quickly remains to be seen. I mean, there's a lot of challenges on those aviation authorities, both with the oversight of an air accident as well as regulating safety. So that part remains unanswered.
Well, speaking about the CEO, Tony Fernandez has been the public face for AirAsia since the plane went down over the weekend. And here's what he had to say about yesterday's findings.
The only slight benefit is that for the people in there is some closure. This is a scar with me for the rest of my life. It doesn't change anything. But a very little percent, there is at least some closure as opposed to not knowing what's happened and holding out hope.
Closure is one thing. Not knowing what happened is something obviously very, very different. And one of the aspects of the conversation that I think that's beginning to bubble around is this was a budget airline. And I put the term budget in quotation marks. Is it time for an international NTSB sort of body that, because they come to the U.S. and is in our aviation recovery process and systems, and is it time to sort of look a little bit more closely at what's happening in other parts of the world with airline safety and the like?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, budget, low cost doesn't necessarily mean unsafe, but Indonesia has a real problem. AirAsia is one of the better ones, but Indonesia cannot fly in Europe. The European Union has banned Indonesian airplanes. That's a function both of the oversight that they provide as well as the safety. Lots of stresses. 71% of the busiest airspace in the world goes through Southeast Asia. At the same time, the infrastructure, the ground control, the radars, the pilot training, the air traffic procedures are not up to the task. So we have going forward an issue. The international bodies are notoriously lowest common denominator. They move like molasses.
Sounds like government, right?
It does. It is government.
So
Yeah.
So I just want to get, Seth, real quick, your thought on that. Is it time for an international body to sort of come in and help put a check on some of these safety issues internationally?
Yeah, and it's not a question of black or white in this case. I mean, you have ICAO, which is a part of the United Nations, which is very involved in aviation safety matters. But certainly, yes, you have sovereignty, and just the question of how much of that nations are willing to give up and defer to others with perhaps more expertise. And just to echo something that Michael said before, not a question really of business model. Some of the very safest airlines in the world, an airline like Southwest in this country and others like it around the world, are budget airlines. And AirAsia, if anything, had to overcome something in its part of the world, which is now taken for granted in places like the U.S. and Europe, which is the idea that a budget airline is saving money on food and other amenities, but not cutting corners on safety. And it had done a very good job of that until now. Now, obviously, a blemish on that record.
Well, we thank you. We thank you both, Michael Goldfarb and Seth Kaplan, for coming in and shedding a little bit more light on this. Thank you both.